Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British Rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders, Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Longsight, and Joshua Long. You are the reason why this content remains grounded in reality. Which doesn't mean that things can't get really weird around here, and I'm starting to wonder if every city in the world just happens to have an old steam locomotive underneath it. Because I keep finding these, and there seems to be no end to them. Really, if you live anywhere, just assume that there's some kind of steam locomotive beneath your feet. Because I think that would be more likely than it not being there at this point. That's kind of where my brain's going. But today, we are going to discuss, yes, another steam locomotive that wound up in a really weird place, and it's actually not underwater. It's under a hill. Not Cobble Hill. No. This is the story of the lost steam locomotive of Roll Hill in Cincinnati, Ohio. Yes, really, I don't know why you're surprised anymore. Roll Hill is, well, a hill, a location in Cincinnati, Ohio. Looking at it, you wouldn't expect anything to be weird about it. I mean, it's a hill, and there's apartments on it. Yep, definitely apartments. They're actually now called the Villages at Roll Hill, but they were once called the Fay Apartments. And you may be wondering why I'm even bringing them up, and that's because their construction is a little relevant to the story involved today. Now, how many of you have heard of the Cincinnati Western Railroad? None of you. Okay, that's fine, because I didn't know it was a thing before I started doing research for this particular topic. The Cincinnati Western Railroad was supposed to be a railroad constructed in the 1850s. By 1854, they had raised about $2.30 million from various investors to construct the new rail line. And it was meant to connect Cincinnati to Chicago, Illinois, passing through Connersville, Rushville, and Indianapolis along the way. Thing is, this rail line never became really a thing. Some of the track was laid, but Cincinnati Western went defunct before they were ever able to really do anything. Why? Well, that's unclear, though I imagine there was some significant financial mismanagement going on, and perhaps some corruption. The people in charge of the project don't seem to be the best based off of what we know about the story. But Roll Hill comes into it because of a tunnel that was supposed to pass through it. When they were working on the new line, the hill was kind of in the way, and they didn't want to go around it necessarily, and it was too steep to effectively go over it, so they were going to tunnel through it. Construction of the tunnel was well underway, and they were pretty deep into the hill, but were never able to get all the way through it, partially due to the fact that they went bankrupt, but the more direct reason, and this is according to legend a little bit, it's unclear if this actually is what happened, but based off of my sources, this seems to be the universally accepted explanation as to why the tunnel was never completed. The company had utilized Irish immigrant workers for the labor. That wouldn't have been uncommon, but what was a little more uncommon is that they decided that they were just not going to pay them. They literally told them that while they were on the job, that they weren't being paid for the work. This is a questionable decision, given the fact that the Irishmen that you just told would not be getting paid for their hard work also had access to the explosives you gave them to tunnel through the hill in the first place. This is relevant, because according to the story, the Irish workers were furious, as they had every right to be, and decided to just blow the tunnel up. And since the railway went bankrupt, they never uncovered it, nor was it ever completed. And over time, memory of the tunnel and the railroad itself was pretty much lost, and stories of the tunnel fell into the realm of legend and myth. That was until the 1960s, over 100 years after the tunnel had been sealed, when the Fay Apartments were being constructed. The nearby Interstate 75 highway had displaced a lot of people that used to live in its path. To compensate these people, the Fay Apartments were constructed for the purposes of housing them. During the process, the tunnel, which everyone had forgotten about and didn't even realize was there, suffered a collapse because of the heavy equipment they were using. The workers on the site apparently recognized that it was a railroad tunnel and even spotted a copper boiler engine with a brass bell. That's right, apparently when those Irishmen got mad and blew up the tunnel, they had left the locomotive sealed inside. But before anything could be done about this, even though the locomotive was right there, And eerily similar to how it went with the Jacksonville locomotive, the supervisors ordered that the sinkhole be filled immediately. Even though it wasn't a sinkhole, there's a tunnel there. An old tunnel that you should probably investigate the stability of. Even if you don't care about the locomotive, this is kind of relevant. But no, just fill it up. And it wasn't widely reported, so everyone forgot about it again. The tunnel was opened a second time in the 1970s when they were moving a road called Baltimore Avenue to make way for the construction of Interstate 74. No one spotted a locomotive this time as it was a different part of the tunnel, and some professors from the University of Cincinnati actually came to look at it. Then it was filled in again. And then, in the 1980s, when the Fay apartment complex was being renovated, the tunnel suffered yet another cave-in. The issue wasn't widely reported, and they filled it in. Again. For the third time. And I feel like nobody's taking this piece of history seriously. Is it just me? Well, a couple of people do seem to want to do something about it. Their names are Dave Pittenger and Robert Carter, and they've been investigating the tunnel and the locomotive for some time. They've pieced together what little they could, basically everything I've told you, and they believe there still might be a way to access the tunnel if enough funds could be raised. They're very interested in the locomotive because the construction workers did say that they did see a locomotive sitting in this tunnel. That means it's been sitting down there for over 160 years. No one's really sure exactly what kind of locomotive it could be. They assume it's small, so it's probably something like a 220, but it's really anyone's guess right now. Based on the era, brass may have been used in its construction as well. Brass doesn't as readily disintegrate like raw iron tends to, so rust may be less of a factor when it comes to seeing what's left of this locomotive. On top of that, it's possible the locomotive isn't really buried in a sense, in that much like the locomotive underneath Brooklyn, it might be sitting in the open air. Which, yeah, it still would have decayed a bit, but not nearly as much as if it was actually underwater. Although Carter has been very realistic with his expectations. He believes that it would suffer significant decay, and there might not be much left, but if there was brass used in the boiler, or definitely the bell, you could get those components out, and it would still be a very interesting piece of Cincinnati history. They both seem to have realistic expectations on what would be expected when it comes to getting this thing out. What they would need to do, who they would need to get, the fact that it would cost a substantial amount of money. But I think their bigger issue is going to be getting permission to do anything at all. Since this tunnel runs underneath an apartment complex where people, live, doing any kind of groundwork is going to take a lot of approvals and probably a lot of rejections. The city isn't going to want just anybody digging around looking for an old locomotive, when if this is a tunnel and they know it's there, there's going to be a risk of a cave-in that could seriously hurt somebody who's again just trying to live their lives in these apartments. It's not as easy as just digging into it. And it doesn't help that a lot of what I've told you, beyond the fact that the railroad and the tunnel definitely at least existed at one point, is still considered an urban legend. Pittenger did interview one of the construction workers that saw this thing in the 1960s. He says it's there, but apparently he was quite old and couldn't offer that many details. There's a lot of might-be's, maybes, could-be's in this situation, and a lot of questions we really don't have answers to. And I definitely think this is going to be one case where any kind of authorization is going to be stopped based off of safety concerns. And I get that, but it still would be very interesting to know if the locomotive is really there and what kind of shape it's in. I would love to see this thing. But who knows how it's going to happen. We don't even know how easy it would be to get access to the tunnel anymore. And really, I'm kind of sick of reading stories about construction jobs where they find something of historical value and proceed to do absolutely nothing about it. Like, I'm trying to be understanding the fact you have a job to do, but seriously, it was right there. But alas, here we are in 2022, and the article I read on this subject was written in 2016. So far, nothing more has happened with the subject, so we may never have a true answer about this. But if you live in Cincinnati, Ohio, you know where Roll Hill is, there might be a locomotive underneath it. Just so you know. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.